How do you feel about WikiLeaks?
Well, I think Assange is just, I mean, he's a
cult of personality.
He's a creepy bastard. So it's hard. It's hard to. I mean, I like transparency. I think the journalistic aspect of it to some degree was legitimate, but I think it's also, if you're going to release certain secrets shouldn't be released. Certain secrets are there because they're keeping people safe, and to release those secrets irresponsibly is to put people in harm's way. And so it's a very mixed thing.
How did you feel about the initial video that he released? Collateral Murder, the one that showed the guys in the helicopters shooting the people on the ground, and a car full of children, and them saying, well, they shouldn't have brought their kids.
Right. Well, the thing that's horrible about that is the horrible but maybe inevitable is that we're just not wired to kind of understand the consequences of our actions once we can fight war remotely. You know, it's just, I mean, if we were just fighting if it was all just, you know, bayonets, there's there's the kind of the inescapability of the horror of war. But the moment you can fly something, you're sitting in your office park outside of Las Vegas, and you're flying a Predator drone 13,000 miles away. It's I'm not suggesting those guys don't have a hard time sleeping at night. Some of them, but it's a very different kind of violence. And one of the scariest things about technology is that it uncouples us from our emotions from the reality of the consequences of our actions, so that the most harmful things aren't actually the most disturbing things. You know, so if you, this is an example actually I used in I think The End of Faith. You know, if you hear that your grandfather fought in World War II and he dropped bombs, he was a bomber pilot, and he dropped bombs over Dresden. That's one kind of level of abstraction of his actions that it doesn't really disturb you about him, and it needn't have disturbed him. And he's at 30,000 feet dropping bombs, not really getting what he's doing. But if you hear Granddad killed a woman and her kids with a shovel, all of a sudden he's the scariest guy you've ever heard of, and probably he couldn't sleep for the rest of his life either, because it takes a very different kind of person to do that. But the guy dropping bombs killed far many more women and children than the guy with the shovel, and so that
it's fascinating, isn't it? And then now we're moving into drones.
Yeah, and so
moves even more.
So we need the burden is to figure out how to have an appropriate emotional response to reality, and to be guided by. It's not to say that our emotions are always the perfect guide. I mean, there may be ways in which we are wired to have a strong response to something that we should just get over, and we're not wired to have an appropriately emotional response to something that really is a massive danger. And so our perception of risk and our perception of harm is not what it needs to be for us to make intelligent decisions and compassionate decisions in these kinds of conflicts.
Did you agree with the video being released? Did you think it was a bad idea? For morale, for
it's hard to separate that from everything else that has happened. But
as far as WikiLeaks, you mean?
Yeah. So I think WikiLeaks. Truth is, I don't even know the ultimate consequences of WikiLeaks. It would just matter what the consequences actually are.
Isn't transparency good?
Yeah, but
up to a certain point.
But do I think Obama should be forced at his next press conference to just share his White House briefing with the world? No. I mean, I think there are certain things that I understand that he and people like him need to know that I don't need to know, and if I knew and blogged about it, I would be harming our national security. So yeah, no, I'm not for the just unlimited
distribution of secrets.
Yeah.
Now to tonight's guest, veteran Middle East correspondent and author Robert Fisk. Following the release by WikiLeaks of nearly 400,000 classified US military documents. Mr. Fisk wrote an angry piece headlined "The Shaming of America" in his newspaper, The Independent. He claimed the Pentagon's anger over the leaks was not because their secrecy had been breached, but because they'd been caught out telling lies. And he joined us just a short time ago from Beirut. Robert Fisk, thanks for being there.
You're welcome.
Now, what's the significance of the close to 400,000 secret US military documents that have been posted by Wikileaks as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think there are several very important elements to this story. First of all, the individual items, like, there were witnesses, American witnesses to torture. They didn't do anything, that the Iraqis, security authorities were torturing Iraqis, that American airstrikes were killing many civilians. We knew about this, but it was always denied by the Americans. I was doing stories years ago about Iraqis torturing Iraqis, and the stories were coming from American officers who were leaking them to me. But of course, every time I wrote them in the paper, the Americans denied that it was true. I went to the scenes of US airstrikes. There were obviously, the limbs, hands, arms of children, babies, women, civilians, as well sometimes as armed men, and we wrote about this. What the WikiLeaks does is it proves beyond any doubt that what we reported was correct, and that what we were told by the American authorities was mendacious. It was a lie. Just remember, the Americans now are saying, shame upon WikiLeaks, it's endangering lives in Iraq. I mean, invading Iraq endangered an awful lot of lives, didn't it? But, if these leaks, if these 400,000 documents had confirmed that the Americans did stop torture, that they didn't kill civilians in airstrikes, US generals would be handing this stuff out free of charge to journalists on the front steps of the Pentagon. It's the fact that it proves how shameful our invasion and occupation of Iraq was, that this has come as such a blow to the United States, and only, I might add, to the West. The reaction in the Arab world, when they looked through all this stuff in the Arabic language press, particularly in Baghdad, was, well, so what's new? We knew all this. We were the people being tortured. We were the people being bombed by the Americans. It's in the West that we're saying, my goodness, is that the case? So the generals lied. That's a big significance at this particular point of this. One bigger significance, I think, and it was Al Jazeera who actually picked this up, was that this famous 242 message, which tells US troops from higher headquarters, presumably Ricardo Sanchez when he was the general in Baghdad, which says, if you see abuse taking place, not by Americans, report it, but basically just do nothing. Al Jazeera found that about the time that message was put out, Donald Rumsfeld had a press conference at the Pentagon in Washington with journalists present who did not understand the significance of what he was saying, because when he did that, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in uniform, General Pace, was saying, well, if a soldier, we didn't know about the WikiLeaks, this is years ago, if a soldier sees someone being tortured, of course, he must stop it. And the camera suddenly switches to Donald Rumsfeld, and Pace's face falls at this point. Well, I think, Rumsfeld says, I think that in fact, he doesn't have to physically intervene, he has to report it. In other words, at that point, Rumsfeld and presumably Sanchez have both agreed Americans would not intervene to stop torture. And that, of course, is against the Geneva Conventions.
Let's go back one step, and I'll come to more of the detail of the torture allegations in a moment. But to start with, these documents reveal 15,000 Iraqi civilian casualties that hitherto were unreported or undocumented. Now, what do you make of these numbers?
Well, look, the fact of the matter is nobody knows how many people have been killed in Iraq, and there are numerous reasons for this. If I can give you an anecdote of my own to show you why. In the worst period, when it was just beginning, the absolute total massacres in Baghdad, I was going in some danger on my own to the mortuary every day to count corpses. It's a very lugubrious thing to do at midday on a summer's day in Baghdad. And, for example, I found that the senior mortician, whom I was talking to and got very friendly with, told me that so many bodies were coming in and so many people were not claiming them because perhaps they didn't want to be associated or they were the wrong religion, that they were just throwing them into mass graves outside. Is just that we have the body count organization, which of course is not allied with any military body, which comes up with various figures. And the figure of 66,000 dead, which is very small compared to what most people thought it would be, is 15,000 more than they had thought it might be. But I think what you've got to say is overall, calculating by the thousands who were dying every month, sometimes, you know, in just 3 weeks in Baghdad alone, I think we're talking about at least 150,000, probably much more than that. But again, you see, because you can't prove it, because you can't actually find it on paper, because there never was such a figure on paper, because it was impossible to get. I'm sure the Americans would try to hide it if they did. You simply don't know, and we won't know.
I'm just going to interrupt you there for a moment, because I want you to respond to what the Pentagon has actually said in its official response to this. It says the period, and you're talking about your own reporting, so the period covered by these reports have been well chronicled by news reports, books and films, and these field reports don't bring any new understanding to events.
Yes, they do. What the field reports do prove that the Pentagon was lying at the time and we were right. But what they're trying to say is, oh, it's an old story. We all knew about that, but the Pentagon was denying it all through those years. Their lies are not being chronicled by the Pentagon statement today. That's the point.